Welcome to Portals of Perception and to Current Openings, what the world doesn't quite get yet, where David, Price, Francis and I endeavor to open what is current. And this is our fifth conversation in this series. And today we bring the focus to the human predicament and the addiction trap. David, welcome.
Thank you, Aviv. Good to be with you again.
So, by way of reflecting on our journey so far, you and I, we've both been in the human journey and transformational development arena for 4 decades and more, actually. And to reveal something about our age here.
Exactly.
And this morning I reflected on the 10,000 hour rule framed by Malcolm Gladwell, where he essentially said, look, if you want to develop mastery in something, recognize you need to invest 10,000 hours in this space. And a couple of years ago, I reflected on, and I tried to calculate the number of hours I've invested in what I will define as the choreography, facilitation, and leadership of transformational experiences. And I decided I will calculate both the time actually I was with groups leading sometimes 3 hours workshop, but often 2 or 3 or 4 days, mostly 4 days experiences. And then the preparatory run, because often for 1 hour of working with a group, I'd be spending 5 or 10 hours meditating, going through the journey in advance to, in a way, build a choreography and the journey possibility, not to set in stone what was going to happen, but to explore options. And then there is the debrief post-process. And a couple of years ago, I came to a calculation that it was somewhere in the 40 to 50,000 hours, and that looked to me initially exaggerated, so I needed to test it, which it comes to maybe 1,000 hours a year. And I discovered it wasn't at all exaggerated, because some years it was certainly more than 40 days, a lot more than 40 days a year in these spaces. So one of the insights that through this journey of creating transformational experiences we've both stumbled on is that if you were going to lead an experience for 4 days, you could predict that on day 3 there will be some crisis that will emerge, partly because day 1 people arrive and they connect with each other and they warm up, and somewhat there is a bit of a detox and acclimatization phase. Day 2, we engage deeper in the inquiry that we are exploring. And day 3, typically people will have to begin to consider seriously what of the prospects that we are exploring would they commit to in terms of their own practice and their own journey. And it is at that point that people need to encounter the habit life and the inertia and all that fights back in the human system against transformation, and that and other elements will often surface one degree of crisis or another. And so we've learned through the process that you would often need to place on day 1 some of the promissory grace that will help people go through the crisis in an easier way, and to plant the seeds and to create a collective sense of promissory grace. There would have to be an element of people needing to, in the first place, learning to trust you as a Sherpa for the journey. And that meant that people needed to see that, not that you are perfect in what you are proposing, but that these are not just words, that it's an inward, outward, inside out type journey, that you are endeavoring yourself to live into this journey, to embody authentically the journey that we are exploring. And then that you have some early success with it, such that it will become an encouragement for them about their success. And then there will have to be somehow in that promissory grace, the sense of relevance and the sense of potency for them personally. Why was it so meaningful and impactful for them? So all of that, in some way, the idea of a promissory grace, we try to see it in the first several episodes, even before we knew that was actually what we were doing, because we did not set ourselves up to do it in quite the same way, but it was built into the design. So I'm just reflecting back on the journey through these lenses. What would you add to that from your experience and from your reflection on our journey so far?
Well, I noticed that in the 4-day process, it also reflects in a 4-hour process, because I'm thinking with my journey, it's been more presenting things in a 4-hour time frame directly to new people and new concepts, new ideas. And I did a similar thing. I took that same 10,000 hours and I tested it, and I found that there was 10,000 hours of 4-hour meetings. So, and then I looked at the 4-hour meetings and realized that there's a certain grace, as you said at the very beginning. People suspend their existing programs. It's like leaving their existing programs at the door to kind of give the guy a chance. So you have to make some good progress in the first hour, particularly in the first 10 minutes, to kind of take some degree of necessary control to get into the topic. The second hour, as long as there's actually new content coming, then there's an acceptance of that. But then, just like you're saying, just like on the third day, there's a certain crisis. On the third hour, the opportunity for existing programs to kind of challenge or question what's been said. And then in the fourth hour, when it's going well, there's a coalescing and a coming together, and the existing programs that folks have come together with the new programs, and there's like an acceptance of that. Or in some cases not, but mostly that's like a good landing. So that's been my experience too. But in that shorter time frame, I think there's something in there about the nature of 4 and the cyclical nature of things, which, whether we're conscious of it or not, applies. So in our conversations, there's that promissory grace at the beginning, and we're finding our way as we go, because it's not like we had a pre-scripted plan, thankfully, about exactly where we're going. We simply know that we want to get to greater depth about the truth of human existence and how to manifest that and be helpful in the process, and then discovering which topic comes next as we proceed. And there's been many different options or ways we could go, but kind of trusting our intuition, which is such a great word, because we're looking to the intelligence of the topic as to where we go next. And so we find ourselves today looking at the human predicament, in particular the addiction trap. I also like to think of it as the identity trap or the identification trap, and noting how it's a little more about that body-brain conundrum that we touched on last time.
And one of the key ideas you proposed on our last episode was this idea that any deliberate journey must begin with appreciating where you are. It's the same idea that when you go into a large park or any trail or any Disney world or Disneyland space, and you walk around the place, you have those maps of the park. And there is always a marker that says you are here. Yes. Because a map without knowing where you are is completely useless. Yes. So you always must begin with appreciating where you are. And I actually remember when I started navigating topographically with maps, we're talking pre-GPSs. Yes. And so one of the key messages that were drilled out, I think I was 14 or 15 years of age, was never force the map on the landscape. And I have been once or twice in a position where I was somewhere and I'm looking at the topographical map and I'm looking at the landscape and something doesn't make sense. And the brain likes to take control and force the map to the territory, and it makes up stories, even though you are 3 hills south from where you thought you are somehow superimposing in your mind, or I was superimposing in my mind the map. And actually the practice is, if you do that, you are likely to create more and more confusion. So therefore the practice is try to trace back to the last point where you were sure where you are, where you can actually trace the map to the topographic landscape. And of course these days people no longer do this very much because they have GPSs anywhere they go. But that's a lost art that shaped this idea. And so it was with this sense that we said, well, let's begin with the human predicament. Yes. And what you essentially said in the way we started that, you said was, look, we can think of the human as 2 systems. And we know that at some point in the future we will upgrade from 2 systems to 3 systems, but for now, you said, let's look at the idea that the body is fully developed, fully evolved. It is already in its heaven, so to speak. And when it works according to design, we experience it as tremendous sense of well-being and health. When something else happens, then there are conditions that we will experience as dis-ease. But that essentially the body knows what it's supposed to do according to design. And then you said, look, the brain-mind compound has that dimension to it where it's unfinished. Unfinished in the sense that we can learn new things, we can connect and literally build new circuitries. And in that sense, that the development capacity is different to just building your muscles. The body can also do certain things in a new way. To an extent, you can build new mechanical skills, although that actually happens through the motor cortex in the brain, and you can innervate the muscles. But there is something, we talked about that sense of the unfinished, the incomplete, in the sense that there is more in that continent, the brain-mind continent, that can be discovered, can be realized. And you set that up to then realize that a lot of where this was taken was not necessarily the best, most optimally wisest choice. And then we quickly took that and journeyed through 7 moves of the mesoteric trace that started with the with the scientific revolution. And we essentially said that. Move 1 was that at some point we got very interested in this idea of taking knowledge as an objective thing outside of us. Up until that time in the ancient world, knowledge was the stories we told around the fire place. And we conveyed stories and meaning in that way, in a tribal fashion. But part of what occurred with a scientific revolution, something else was coming online. That's the esoteric dimension that we will get to another time. And we translated that as the release, humanity translated that as the release to see knowledge as something outside of the human. That's the idea of reification of knowledge as an objective thing that you, the credence of that is privileged through instruments outside the human instrument. And that was given preference. And that was made possible by what we describe as the second move, which was essentially shutting down ourselves increasingly to the intuition, the instinct, the inner lives, the moral compass, and that these 2 moves created a byproduct that we describe as the third move, which is that increasingly human life got distanced and separated from the well-being, the natural flow that joins the natural alignment of living. And that partly that third move accelerated what we describe as the fourth move, which is brains increasingly separated. And that's where we will go more into today, separated from that natural cycle of life, coupled with unlocking the natural inventiveness and innovative power of the brain, unlocked with that orientation that was more exterior based and mechanical based, unlocked the Industrial Revolution. And the joy and the excitement of building engines and machines and all that, a lot of which is awesome and great, but then that was coupled with what we described in the fifth move, which was the advance of modern finance and banking and the innovation of money-on-money return that unleashed this greed-driven, extractive, exploitative orientation towards the planet and natural resources, which is where the brain is running even more into this fantasy that we are gaining control, and that is powered by the sixth move, which we described as local, national, and global institutions, that the establishment of institutions that enshrined, if you like, all that was produced in the orientation, the alignment, the sense of these earlier moves, bringing online the seventh move, really, which was the idea of normalizing all of that. So the operating system of this entire cascade being normalized so much that we see this to be the expected paradigm. So the healthcare system, the education system, all the large institutions, they bring that orientation of no longer seeing the human as the creative being that the human naturally is, but seeing the human as the consumer, the economic unit that it is. And so that we brought that trace all the way to me proposing that the question we are looking to explore today is, so what happens then in light of all that? What happens to the brain and to the human system when it is divorced from its natural well-being and it is taken in this ride that we're describing over the last 400 years? And then inside it, what are some of the reasons for the addictions? And that we live in in a time where we see addictions all over the place. Why that is the case, and how does it relate to the story of the human predicament? And why is it that the brain needs this increasing stimulation and all that we see in the pathologies of addiction? So I just threw a lot at you. The trace of our last episode and me framing the entry to addiction. Where would you want to lead this journey, please?
All right. I'm going to pick on almost the last word you said there, which is pathology. And I love looking at the etymology of words because they give us a trace through time. And pathology says to me, what's the study of the path that we're taking? Because a path is something you walk along. What's the path of the human race? What's the path of the individual? And it always gives rise to a pathology, because for every clockwise movement, there's always a counterclockwise movement. And they know this even in the study of pharmaceuticals. They say if something has a clockwise effect, which they literally call it that, they look for the so-called side effects, which they also call the counterclockwise effect. So as a human race, that sevenfold system you just outlined, that produces a pathology, because it's the ology or the study of the path that we've actually taken. So, and of course, if we combine that with psychology, it can become a psychopathy. that's also possible, which is the pathy based on the psychologies that we've created, or the psyche we've created. So the psyche of our that we appear in, if we think of the collective psyche, we're looking at the pathology of the human race and the predicament it's brought us to. And that has with it, you could say, clockwise effects, which we could say are positive, if we chose to use that, counterclockwise, negative effects, and we're living in what's been passed to us. So the age of reason has great benefit with it, but it also led to, as you say, a separation of the magic of living from the actual referenceability. So I think even when referring to the brain is a large territory, and there's the primary referenceability in our mental system, which is like the age of reason. But there's also the whole system of the connection, just to touch on this, because this is so strong in like the yogic tradition and so many mystical traditions, which is the tradition of accessing a different part of our brain. So I think of it as cerebrum and cerebellum, to just current language, but of course there's many more parts than that. But is it that we're developing one part of our brain, or overdeveloping one part and underdeveloping another? That may also be a way of looking at it. So one way I've been thinking of in preparation for today a little is about the idea that we seem to need to be able to identify. That's why I call it that identification trap, which leads to addiction. And we have these sayings like, well, I am a. And the moment you hear I am a, it's like, oh, caution, I am a doctor, I am a biochemist, I am a waiter, I am a carpenter. And that's really a skill. It's something that we do. It's not something that we are. So when we look at the rest of organic life, what we see is nothing else on the planet needs to identify with being anything apart from itself. And I think there's a big clue in that. Like we look at a cat, we look at a tree, we look at a bird. It doesn't claim to be anything other than what it is. And they're all in what I think of now as a first step system. And then when we get to the human, we have two parts, like you said. If we were only living in our body and we had instinct, like the instinct of a squirrel or the instinct of a bird, we would know exactly what to do. We'd be living unconsciously within the rhythm of the planet. But that's not us. We have this second system, our brain system, which is then always looking, as you say, it's not fully evolved, and it's looking for what to identify with and how can it fulfill itself. And so we get this brain-body conundrum. We get this, instead of integration, we can find ourselves in disintegration. And the addictions, in my experience, dealing quite a bit with addictions in counseling, the addiction is primarily the brain, or particularly that frontal part of the brain, but let's take the brain as a whole for now, is the brain looking for increased stimulation. And I think of the brain as an electrical organ. That is, our mind is energetic and our brain is physical and energetic together. I look at sayings in the language and we say things like mind out. Well, that means it can step out. Absent-minded, my mind's gone missing. Presence of mind, oh, it's come back. So we have this dynamic of the mind, which is more energetic. We don't say to someone, I'll give you a piece of my brain. We say, I'll give you such a piece of my mind. Remember my mother, I'll give you a piece of my mind. Well, you can give a piece of your mind because it's more the energetics that are formed within the brain. So there's increasing study in this, of course, in the whole area of neuropathy, and the idea that as our thoughts change, we actually make new pathways in our brain. But the pathways in the brain are second. They're not first. We change our mind and we change our brain. So we change the energetics of what's going up here, and that can change the pathways. So how does someone become addicted? At some point, they had to get introduced to something which gave them a stimulant that then the brain mind system is like, oh, we we feel high. Interesting expression. People say we get high. And then we get high on something, which is a brain state, but then we tend to crash because it's an artificial stimulant. It's not a natural development state. So we then look for means. That's not right. It's not we look for. I think of our brain as almost like a separate. Imagine your brain as a separate organism. And I know we've spoken about this, previously in working together. But the brain is looking for where can it get stimulation? How can I get so-called high? How can I reach a higher state? Because it's an energy-based organ and it wants to get the highest level of energy, the most potent energies running through it that it can. So it's not only a matter of mental exercise or going to the brain gym that determines the condition of our brain, it's the magnitude and the level of the current, like the current opening. It's the level of current that's coming through the pathways that's so very determining. That's why if someone experiences a moment of shock, it can print their brain pathways in seconds. I'll tell a short story, which has happened when I was about 17. I was hitchhiking in Scotland, and I was given a lift by a chap in a little car, picked me up. So I got in the car, and I smoked at the time. So part of my making bridges was to say, "Would you like a cigarette?" And he said, "No. I gave up smoking in 3 seconds." So I'm like, "What?" I said, "How did you?" Because I was giving up smoking or thinking of. So how did you do that? He said, "Oh." I said, "It's a story." He said, I was working in a quarry and I worked with dynamite. So we bore a hole and we'd put the dynamite in the hole, and then I would wire it up and go long distance, and then we'd press the depressor and it would cause the explosion. And he said, one day, there I am with the dynamite doing my thing, and I realized I had a cigarette lit in my right hand. And he said, that sent such a shock through my system. I gave up on the spot and I've never smoked since. So that to me was a very powerful story of how when there's enough energetic intensity comes through, it can change the pathways rapidly. And where the addiction comes from is looking for that excitement, that stimulation. So as I mentioned last time, around here in Florida, there's multiple casinos. And why does the body doesn't want to go to a casino, but the brain is looking for stimulation. The body doesn't want to be playing video games of sudden death, but the brain is into the stimulation. So we get the separation between the two systems, rather than them working together with, say, our brain working with the natural stimulants that are coming through our body soul system into our brain. And I put the word soul in there, but by whatever name a person wants to put to it, whether it's their sort of their animus or their prana or whatever name they wish to use, but there's an energy that's surging through our body that can then enter into our brain, and our brain, the energy it runs on, surges into our body.
So you're establishing 2 key premises there. One is, yet again, the brain is part of a larger human orchestra, but operates in a slightly different way in that its octave is incomplete, unfinished. It has the capacity to bring online new circuitries and new capacities. Premise 1. Premise 2, that it actually runs on energy, and that within that realization, it always seeks to find the higher octane energetic quality, especially once the brain is separated from the feedback loop of a well-balanced, well-orchestrated human life. And so what we are reflecting on is the idea that the human is an orchestra, and part of the idea of an orchestra is that actually all instruments are meant to play together. And when, for example, the spleen or the liver or the lungs, they overreact and overplay. We have names for these conditions in the medical book. But when the brain overreacts and overplays its role, we don't have names necessarily in the book because we take it now, that has been normalized. We've now lived centuries in a system where the brain orientation and its desire for more and more and more exciting food, exciting energy, exciting stimulation led the way, and we now see this as normal. And the link, the move we are describing is how that pathway in the brain to process higher and higher octane, higher and higher stimulation is the very pathway, the very feature becomes the bug in actually producing addictions and obsessions. Because, and so the question is, who is serving who right now? When you look at the totality, in terms of each person to themselves and humanity at large, I can ask myself, is it the case that you are still in a unified, harmonious orchestra, all instruments playing the symphony of life and trying to unlock the melodies of the symphony of the purposes of life? Scenario one. Or no, increasingly, have you found yourself in a lifestyle and in a culture where it's about the brain now controls the symphony, and its score is give me the next stimulation and the higher stimulation? And is it now the case that it has been reversed? Rather than the brain acquiescing as part of a larger symphony, it controls the proceeding. And it is there that we are pointing to the suggestion that that is the pathway, the system that activates addiction, and where the brain can become, if we're not careful, can become a controlling tyrant that would drive you mad.
Right.
Right? And will, because the definition of insanity is doing more and more of what is not good for you to create a deeper and deeper cycle of wanting more and more of what is not good for you, which is the same definition of what addiction is. So what else would you say to that phenomenon? Because what we're describing, David, is not just the one person case. We are living now in a societal, institutional, economical system that throws more and more of what's not good for itself because it tries to solve its problems with the very thing that created the problem. That's another definition for addiction. Try to solve the problem with what created the problem, throw more money at a system that has free money, and that will solve the economic problem. It's the same feedback loop that builds in the addiction cycle.
You can't clear toxic energy with toxic energy. So it needs something cleaner and clearer. The word sanity is very interesting. It's like, I saw this once in New York, a big truck went by and it said sanitation department. I thought, well, that's really interesting, because what keeps us sane? And sane is the word sanitation, which is to do with cleaning. And with nutrition, we get the idea of eating foods which we can assimilate good energy from. But what isn't understood is every thought pattern contains an energy. And everything we look at and everything we listen to, I mean, when we look at our ears and our eyes, they are receiving energies, feeding them straight into our brain. Our nose, our mouth, we're taking food in and air in, and goes down into our body to be combusted. But what we look at and what we listen to is coming straight into our brain, which is why, again, I'm saying it's electrical in its nature. And so there's different levels of energy and nature of signal. So if somebody has what's called a dirty mind, then what's that saying? It's saying that their mind has taken on toxicity. It's not physical dirt, but it's an energetic dirt which has entered their mind. So we say it's a dirty mind. Or we say, oh, they've got such a bright mind or an enlightened mind. Well, the level of the mind is going to influence the patterning in the brain. We're back to that idea again. So what we fill our mind with is then reined into our brain, and that then produces the pathology. So that's the pathology that's then created. So if we are bringing into our mind anti-life signals, to say that, toxic signals. So let's take the example of super stimulation through gain and loss, like that idea of going to the casino and kind of, as they say, betting the ranch. You know, everything's going on, whether the roulette wheel is going to come up red or black.
Or the larger casino called the stock market. The same deal.
Absolutely. Same principle, yes. Am I going to, let's look at that, two choices. Am I going to win or lose, right? Is it going to be gain or loss? And that is it's a very strong stimulation into our brain. There's a higher stimulation, I believe, but we'll get to that in the human proposition dynamic. But when it comes to stimulants, gain and loss is a powerful one. Obsession, as you say, identification with things. Nothing else on the planet identifies in the way that the human does. And even when we go back to earlier human, we find more of a system where it's like you take when I lived in Canada, I went to visit the Nipissing people and the Iroquois, and that their system as it was that you would keep something as long as you were using it. And then if somebody else wanted it, they'd come and take it. That's fine because you're not using it. You only keep it as long as you're using it. And then it transfers through the tribe. Now, the way we are now, we're a long, long way away from that. Not saying right or wrong or whatever, but just look at how the human has its pathology has changed to the point where we now want ownership of things. Our body doesn't own anything. Our body is happy to breathe. And that's it's happy to breathe. It's happy that its pulse is working. It's happy that the heart is beating. It's in the present moment. But our brain says, that's mine. That's my piece of gold. That's my swimming pool. That's my whatever the thing is. And then it puts fences around it and creates an identification with it. And then people go into brain comparison between who owns the most. Now, that's a very major thing in our current pathology. And again, not to say right or wrong or whatever, but just to say, well, look at that interesting pathology that the human has built around owning stuff, when the reality is when they leave here, they're not going to take anything with them. That's a very curious pathology to have. And a person can become very obsessed, as you say, with what they own. They can become a miser, which is the root of the word misery. They can be so much about gathering the gold to themselves and not spending it that they have a miserable life. And that's their pathology. So this is then the dynamic of why do we even have psychologists, psychiatrists? It's all about looking at the second system, the brain system, the mental system of the human, and what we've created and, as you say, normalized. And just one more thing on that, which is the normalization I see coming, you touched on last week, is seeking to increase stimulation with so-called artificial intelligence. That's another normalization just around the corner, which is implanting bits of computer and things. Already in Denmark, I saw someone who got implanted in their finger what they needed to open doors, all of their house locks, car locks, everything. Just hold up the finger transmits the signal, the door opens. Wow, what an advancement. But then, is it? It's like, is that really going to help us advance as a human race? Is it not? Again, leaving it open, but I do like the idea of enhancing our natural intelligence.
Yeah.
I think there's something to look at there.
Well, you wish that person doesn't have an accident and lose that finger, because if they lost that finger, they lose their access to all that they own. Yeah. In your story of the person with the dynamite, it was the shock of the threat and the total blindness that he recognized in that moment, how close he was to blow himself up. And the fear and the shock of that produced, as you said, an instant reroute in the brain that got him off smoking. Yeah. And the point you're making there is the power of that impression, because of the conductive power of wanting, of that reflex of I must survive, that is wired so deeply into us. Similarly, differently and similarly, if you are trading on Wall Street and you're able to make many millions, perhaps billions of dollars in one trade, win or lose, it actually changes your brain, because money is also power. And when you traffic, when you process, when you get through your system, there is nothing in the human system that can naturally actually comprehend billions of dollars, because when you say to somebody, what will you do if you were now given $20 billion? So they go through their wish list and they spend several millions, but they don't even begin to touch the billions. So there is nothing natural in the human system to talk about those sums of money, those powers in the individual context. So what is it we are seeing? We're seeing increasingly that the last 400 years produced a way of living that brought us more and more to live in our heads. At this time, somebody can be behind their computers all day long, completely separated from the body, from the natural world, from going out to nature to get the impressions, to see the cycles of the day, the cycles of the seasons, and so on. And part of the product of that is a disembodied life. And what we are asserting that the move is, so the brain is in one way excited about that tremendous freedom it was given through cyberspace and all those imaginary tools that it traffics in, soon the metaverse. And at the same time, right to next to that excitement of the brain, it also leaves with fear, with anxiety, with panic next to it all the time as to when will those things be taken away. Because it always wants to guarantee and secure its continuance, and that's part of living in our heads in a way that got separated from the larger cycles of life and living and birth and death and all the rest of it. And I'm proposing that part of the move we are describing here, the move to addictions and obsessions, is the way for the brain to try to establish replacement certainty. It used to experience the certainty of being part of the orchestra of life. When that is separated, it seeks to replace that certainty with new certainty. And that new certainty, one expression is fundamentalism. Another expression is nationalism. A third expression is materialism and the everything we're describing with greed-based economy. Primarily what we're describing is the rise of extreme ideologies, extreme everything, by the way. We talked about trading on Wall Street. Extreme sports appeared in the same time. But extreme ideologies was a product of the last 200-300 years. I'm not saying there were not horrible things that happened in the past all the way back to the ancient world, but extreme ideologies is a product of the last 200-300 years. And I'm saying that corresponds with the story we are telling, with fanaticism, with obsession, with addiction. All of that is the byproduct of very much becoming disembodied, all in our heads. And what we are describing is that that is part of the human predicament.
Yes.
And we are leading to perhaps that next inquiry, that part of what we've seen over the last few decades is that we try to address that. One of the ways it is addressed is with this idea of mindfulness. And you made this provocative comment in one of our earlier conversations that actually mindfulness was a lot more about emptying the mind. It's called mindfulness, but the practice itself feels like and looks like much more like a mind emptiness rather than a mindfulness. And you proposed that that was not actually such a good idea. So first, anything else you would say about the move I was trying to describe there with a disembodied sense of living in our heads? Secondly, you observed that mindfulness was an attempt to get the brain back to be as part of the body, and you said, although it is effective, it is not necessarily the smartest or the wisest way. What else would you add to this bridging, or what else would you say to the conundrum of mindfulness?
Yes. Well, as you're speaking, what dawns on me is how the body does not have an ego. The body is in the now, in the present, connected to universal, you could say planetary, energies and signals. So every organ has its own particular energy. We could refer to Chinese medicine. They've known this for thousands of years, like the kidney energy, the qi in the kidney, the energy in the heart, the energy in the lungs, the energy in the spleen, that they are different energies. And so they manifest as different organs. If they were the same energy, they'd have the same shape and form. So where there's an energy, there's a corresponding shape and form to go with that energy. So, and we can see that. The thing with our brain is that according to how we think and how we go on, we create the patterns in our brain, in our mental, through our mental system into our brain. So it strikes me that our body does not have an ego. So which was the point that you made. It doesn't try to identify with anything. It's that other part that is attracted, even addicted to identifying. Yes. So our ego is a brain property. And then it summons up, or what goes with it is feelings. So there's emotions. I feel great today. I feel this today. I feel that today. And we put words with it. And we have an ego consciousness. I love the fact you take the word ego consciousness. If you just change the letters around, it says geo, as in geography, geodetics, which is to do with a planetary view. Our body, naturally, I think of as being connected to geo. But our brain can create an ego, interesting word, id entity, an entity of id, which is whatever id is. It's like the I of us, the ego of us. And we grow an ego according to what our opinions are attached to. So this is where we see the polarization so much in the world, where we have a polarization, say, that's left-leaning, or a polarization that is right-leaning, which doesn't mean that they are real. It doesn't mean they're connected to what is, because our brain has the permission to create what I think is, which is not necessarily what is. And this to me is where we get into the trace of the mystics of the world, the sages, the philosophers. They're all trying to get into what is. The essence, the scientists, the genuine, trying to get to the truth of the universe scientists, they're trying to get to what is. And then we have the what I think is. So you mentioned Disney World before. It's a great example. The safest place, I met what's called a Leo, which I didn't know which it stands for. I thought, oh, you're a Leo. Oh, she said, and I said, what? And I took that to be her astrological sign. She said, no, I'm a law enforcement officer. I'm a Leo. Derivative, right? So this was in Florida. She said, the only place I go not armed in Florida is Disney World, because they have the best security in the whole of Florida. So she said, anywhere else I go armed as a law enforcement officer, but not Disney World. So Disney World is this artificially created, what somebody made what I think is. But the reality behind something looking like a mouse is a human in a costume. It's an artificial creation. And so it only connects to a certain level and nature of energetics. And the quest of the mystics is to get to the real what is. That is that higher frequency of getting reconnected to the universe. So our brain system getting reconnected. Now, to me, the interim step, mindfulness, so-called, is an interim step, as was so-called transcendental meditation, which is focusing usually on the pulse. So taking the pulse and connecting to the heart rhythm, or breathing, getting in tune with the breath. And so what is that doing is our brain system coming into synchronization with our body system. Even the word yoga was the idea of yoking two things together, our brain system and our body system. Now, mind emptiness, which is to me what it really is about stopping the toxic ego process. So they say, shut down the monkey mind. Well, the monkey mind is the ego mind. So, and through the trace of the day, I've been observing the last few days, how often little snatches of songs get thrown up in my ego mind, my ego brain, in my monkey mind. And I'll be going along doing something, and suddenly this song from 40 years ago pops in, or something else pops in. If I identified with those, I could really lose it, seriously lose it. So I'm thinking, what's this got to do with what I'm doing now? Absolutely nothing. It's been triggered by some external link that I'm not even aware of, maybe a poster that I saw 10 minutes ago driving along the road that triggered a reference, and my brain is dutifully giving that reference. So when we blank the brain, blank its thoughts, then we go into a healing mode, because if our body is connected to natural geo signals and universal signals, and our brain is connected to Disney World, then Disney World is putting into our body something that isn't. It's a pretend what is, but not the real what is. Or if we can't shut off being the chief financial officer of a corporation, and so all this stuff to do with finances, or if we can't shut off the fact that we're trying to buy a house, or we can't shut off the fact that we're owing funds to the electric company, or whatever the thing is. I think of it like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. It wasn't going the bells. It was going the bills. Because that's kind of what's going on when we get these interferences. And what mindfulness is doing is seeking to escape the interference, which clues us back into the natural energies of our body. I don't find it's not a dangerous practice, and it's something which is it gives a bit of relief. It gives momentary relief, mostly so that people can get back to what they were doing before, but with extra energy. See it being used that way, like in corporations, like the person's like, well, I'll take my 15 minutes meditation so I can go and double down on being a chief financial officer, whatever. So they're using it to then re-engage more powerfully than before. The actual mystical way was to take the mind and brain and to tune it in to universal process, and so bring in a higher energy. So our brain can actually be, I suppose you could say, angelic to our body. We're processing really high frequency, high level, high energy signals and raining that into our body. Then you've got mindfulness.
Yeah.
And human proposition stuff, but to me that's a mind that's full of a higher frequency. And that is a higher form of meditation. Mind emptiness is just stopping the toxic flow so that we can allow, say, the energy of the heart. That's why people say, I want to be heart-centered. The energy of the heart can come up into the mind, and that is healing, compared to playing Mortal Kombat on a video game, right? So it's all about what's processing through our brain-mind system and what that rains into our body. I think we said how, it's like no one ever experienced a heart attack because our heart doesn't attack us. But we can attack our heart by sending anti-heart signals into our body. So at least when we go into mind emptiness, and that's very much about being in the now. Mm-hmm. Our brain has the permission to go into the future and to go into the past, but our body stays in the present moment. So mind emptiness brings us into the present moment, which is healing to our brain system as well. But it's not making a higher connection, which would be, that to me is mindfulness, is bringing in something that then fills up the entire system.
So let me try and retrace through some of the moves you are describing. You're describing mindfulness and certain meditational techniques as interim steps.
Yes.
And as such, there's nothing wrong with them, but you are making a provocative statement about they are not all that they're cracked up to be, because of that awareness that they lead to getting harmonized again with the body, but not necessarily getting attuned to the bigger prospect of their potential. So I'm going to retrace through this and try to add few layers, because what we can curiously juxtapose or put alongside that is the realization that some very powerful techniques that can produce good results, sometimes very powerful insights, if they show up already from a place that's 1 or 2 or 3 steps removed from health and well-being, then the originating intelligence is sourced, and as you said, a place of pathology, because of, as you said earlier, what you had was a circumstance where people were either solving to or studying disease and illness rather than studying and building on health and well-being. One way that it shows up is in psychology, because sure, Freud made tremendous breakthroughs in his insights in some ways, and building on him and different to him, Jung expanded in his work into appreciations of the collective unconscious and so much more. And yet at the same time, for both of them, some of the formative insights were unearthed, were developed when they worked with people that were either mildly or extremely disturbed.
Yes.
So what you have is that the founders, the fathers of modern psychology into the 20th century, with all their brilliance and what they were able to unlock, some of the ecology inside of which they sourced the creative and brilliant discoveries was essentially the ecologies of the study of pathologies and disease, rather than the study of health and well-being. And in some way, there is some sense of parallel path and comparative value in reflecting that some of the Eastern practices earlier on, what are they trying to do? They're trying to solve to human suffering. And the point we are making is there is nothing wrong with solving human suffering. It's just that is not the end goal of life. There is a simple way to prove that. Suppose you and I now solved all human suffering. What would we do now? Would we have nothing to do? No, we have plenty to do, because there is beauty to discover, and there is truth and wisdom to unlock and put together, and there is goodness and joy and happiness to facilitate and enable, and there are connections and communion with the universe at large, as you suggested, to develop and liberate. So there is so much more to do. So therefore, when the focus of meditational practices and or of therapies are based and were sourced in the idea of alleviating and perhaps eliminating suffering, they can be very powerful, and they unlocked profound states and capabilities. But if they were already divorced, like as we talked earlier about the idea of navigating, if they already started offset from from being tethered and centered in the idea of human health and optimal functionality, then something is missed. Now, in the case of psychology and therapy, so that was partly addressed by positive psychology in the later part of the 20th century, because they kind of stumbled on that realization that a lot of the study of the first half of the 20th century was, well, how do we bring people back from dysfunctional to functional? And they said, no, the real project of psychology, the real project of health has to be more than bringing people to normalcy. It has to be this idea of unlocking the greater potential. So great corrective or remedial move, the problem was that it brought its biases. It was largely fashioned in the 80s and 90s, a time that also we were experiencing our formative fashioning part of our journey, and that period had its bias. It was a very positive thinking, optimistic, integrating East and West, New Age, space and time, very much also driven by the commercialization of that. And part of the bias brought into positive psychology was this idea of quick and sometimes instant fix. Just do this and it'll all be all right. And it's curious how mindfulness, as you described, was brought into the corporate space, and people were in some companies, the ecologies for that were created. It was all about, okay, how can we make you even more powerful producer for us at work? Here you have this special ecology with background music. Do your mindfulness for 15 minutes twice a day, and you'll become a better team player. You'll produce for us even more breakthroughs. And all I'm juxtaposing here is that some of those techniques and capabilities, they already started from the place that's somewhat displaced 1 or 2 degrees from the bigger prospects of life and the purposes of life. And we see the evidence of it in what, for example, you'd see with people that would return from 2 or 3 or 4 days meditational retreat experiences. So they would go to those experiences, and as you described, they will practice mindfulness. And maybe it's as you said, in one case, it's getting attuned with your in-breath and out-breath cycle and getting attuned with your body rhythm. And right next to mindfulness, they will practice some forms of versions of heartfulness, which, as you said, is getting connected with feelings. So the variety of practices of feel your pain, feel your suffering, feel your anger, discover how you can transmogrify that energy with compassion and care and love and so on. Great practice. And that sometime will be coupled with various shadow practices, meditative or dialogical practices, where there is an inquiry-based exploration to search to find what is the insight that underlies the anger and underlies the pain, and all of which is very assisting. And we are not saying these are not useful practices. What we are essentially proposing is the following awareness and the following move inside the human predicament, which was you have people going to experience those, and in some cases even experience peak experiences where they get to have those dissolving of the ego for a moment or a longer moment together with others, and that sense of connectedness. But if it is experiential based, and there were not the scaffolds that supports more of a sustained way of being with the propositional nature of those experiences, what you have is the person then comes into the arrangements of their life. And here I do a full circle to why you are alerting us to the danger of emptying the mind, because if the mind was emptied out, it is then, this is again a universe that abhors emptiness. And when it sees emptiness, it rushes to fill that void. And what will typically fill the void, the emptiness, is anything that's nearby. And often what's anything that nearby is made of is low-grade toxic energy. So what you have is, in the general way of going in about life and living. So what you have is a person is taken inside an experience where they have that emptying of the mind and the dissolving of the self, and then they drop back into, well, nothing that offers them the scaffolds and the structure to take that experience and journey with it in the context of the bigger prospects of life and the purposes of life and living. There isn't the communal structure, there isn't the knowledge structure necessarily, there isn't the process methodologies that builds the rituals and the ceremonies that are part of the living of a purposeful life. And because of that, they experience depression and implosion in self, which is where we say some of these practices, as good as they are, in the final analysis lead to, unless placed inside a broader ecology and context of practices and purposeful living, can lead to actually undesired byproducts because of those moves. So anything you'd build on this, as we try to substantiate the benefit of mindfulness, but also the risk of emptying the mind without further ecology that would build the mind, what it is naturally designed to do, which is, as you said, the mind is naturally designed to connect with and be in communion with the greater prospects of life. And just to ground us, actually, what is the mind? The mind can be everywhere. The mind can be in any part of the body. Mind can be right around us in the energetic fields around us. The mind can operate in near space, in mid space, in deep space, by which we mean the mind can configure any constellation, any configuration that exists anywhere in the universe, and bring about that experience into the human possibility, which is what I believe was the core message when you said, well, beware if you think that emptying the mind is the end goal. It's only an intermediary step to clear toxicity to enable you to engage with the bigger prospects of life.
Yes, that's well said. And it was the introductory process to ancient meditation techniques. Like the idea of fixing on a point in the wall and staying on that point, and then letting the emptying of that so-called monkey mind and just being with that point and blanking. The blank state was the introduction to the next step, which is becoming a connective media into a higher energy source. And that's the missing part. I call it the law of energetic displacement. I thought, why not put a name with it, which is that we want to displace one energy with another. So if we create an empty space and don't actually then set about making new connections, most likely what happens is what was already there comes back. In a lower case, the person may actually bring in stuff that was lower than what was already there. But the purpose of that initial interim step, as you called it, is then to be able to make to take something and create a higher connection. That's where we get, the traditions of such things as mantras and callovers and prayers to make a higher connection of some kind. So if someone has an energy, let's say, of anger, that's got a certain, and they become what's called an angry person. There's a difference between getting angry and being angry, being an angry person. Just like someone can be a nice person or a kind person, or we put character labels according to the nature of energy process we see from someone over time. That person's exact, that person's thorough, that person's careless. We put these terms to describe their pathology. And when it comes to coming back into the realm of normal's a pretty low bar. Sort of come to, like, the level of normal is a low bar to go for. Go back to the yogi tradition 3,000 years ago. They weren't trying to get into normal. They were trying to get into super conscious. They were trying to get into higher mental and emotional states.
And you're using higher and lower also in what you said earlier, in terms of the higher octane, higher grade energy, lower grade energy, anger being a low grade energy. Although, let me just pause there for a moment, because part of what some of those meditational practices, Eastern practices, were meant to produce was to free you up from the psychological content of those triggering events in your life, mostly driven, as you said, by the psychologies that were built around on top of those survival, sexual, social triggers in life, a social drive to gain power and stature and position, and how those are wired in the system as part of the survival mechanism. But the point is, just in that for a minute, that why it is an incomplete step, because even anger can actually be used inside a purposeful function. The point you're making is do you become an angry person, at which point anger runs you, or do you use purposefully the energy of anger to help you achieve a certain outcome that you determined you want to achieve? This is an important distinction you proposed there.
Yes. And I even think one way to think of it is there's red anger and there may be blue anger. Blue anger is cold. It doesn't run with the same heat. So the question always is, what is actually, just like we said, where do we actually start in the human predicament? What is actually in process in a person? Like, what are the energies that are actually there? And when it comes to the human proposition, can those energies be changed? Which to me, transformation begins, its first point, because we have that ability, that second life in us, which can select. We can use our human superpower. And our human superpower, the way I think of it, is the ability to make conscious choice. So we can actually intervene. We can even take a thought process that's running, catch it, and intervene and say, no, I don't want that. I'm canceling that process. I'm bringing in something else. We can do that once we're, as you say, in the place of being in control, rather than having something else control us. So a compulsion, an addiction, identification, possession, these are all names of something else driving us, obsession, rather than us actually being in control of the equipment. So it has within it the idea of actually taking control and steering even our brain life in the direction we want it to go, rather than random programs, many of which may have been put in there by other people or by the media or by some other method, which was not self-selected in the first place. To be a self-determining life and actually make our own choices of what energies we want and don't want, that's quite the transformation. And I think to remind this idea that transformation begins energetically, and transformation is not information. Information without application does not make transformation. It needs information, which is an interesting word, form at ion. It's just coming into form. Then we need to apply it. And then we've got a chance of actually something transforming. If we just have the information, it doesn't change the energetics. So transform at ion to me speaks about changing the form, like our neural pathways, by changing the energy. So we transform at ion. An ion, we said before, an ion is a positively or negatively charged particle. I think of any word that ends in ion as an energy word. So whether it's obsess ion, congratulate ion, transform at ion, it's always telling us, hey, it's an energy word. If it ends in ion, it's something to do with energetics. So if we're going to transformation, we need to transform our energetics. And one way to do that is superimpose a new higher frequency energy on a lower frequency energy. So if we can take patience and superimpose it upon impatience, just one example, they can't live in the same space.
Mm-hmm.
So if we become a patient person, then impatience leaves,
Mm-hmm.
because it can't be in the same space. So that to me is the law of energy displacement.
So let me try and bring us to a final closing round with bring focus again to the distinction you made between the intermediary step there. Because so what you're describing, that part of the intervention of mindfulness and part of the intervention of emptying the mind has about it the like if we are a lake and that lake is filled with toxicity, how are you going to clear the toxicity? So now we looked, and I mentioned last time we spoke, and everybody likes to quote this idea from Albert Einstein, that you can't solve the problems at the levels that the problem was created. You actually have to create for yourself a new vantage point from which to look at the problem. So one way of attempting to solve the toxicity in the lake is you take your little bucket and you try to empty the toxic water one bucket at a time. It's a very laborious process.
Yes.
Over time, it will lead to result, and somewhat stopping the brain from toxicity has a bit of that, okay, I'm noticing that something is arising and I let this bucket out of my system. I notice that something else is arising and I release that bucket out of the lake. Wonderful. The hints that you're offering here about the other greater potential of the mind is a different way of looking at the problem of clearing the toxicity in the lake, which is looking to find the path to open the way for the stream of life, of the river of life, to flow into the lake, such that rather than you actually try to clear the lake, the flow of life does the clearing and the healing and the heavy lifting for you. And that is where we are heading in the idea of the human proposition. We are right now, in these earlier episodes, still staying with grappling with recognizing the human predicament. And we explored today a little deeper into the sense of what occurs when we are so out of balance, so much in our heads, so much in our brains, and how that corresponds with fanaticism and extreme ideologies, and with a society that is so highly addicted in the individual sense and also in the societal arrangement. And we suggested that some of those, both therapy practices and Eastern practices adopted in the current context, they bring intermediary results, but in some cases, because those originated in the first place from the study of pathology rather than from the study of health and well-being, they lead you half a step, but not the complete step of the journey. And I invite you to offer any closing comments on our journey today, and we'll pause it there.
All right. So I'd say living in our minds is fine, depending what's in our minds. So being in our head is if what's in our head is, I'll take the lake analogy. The first step in clearing out the lake is stopping putting more toxicity into the lake. So that's job one, is like stop it. That's the first thing. That's the first place we can take control. If we've got toxic energy coming in, first thing we can do is block that. So stop bringing in more toxicity. Then start bringing in something that's got a higher energetic frequency or connection. And our mind is very helpful in that. So when our mind is full of connection to energies which bring, let's take certain religious terms, illumination, enlightenment. It's all to do with light, levity, having a bright idea, lightness of mind. Then there's actually like a glow, that we can see. We look at religious artwork, we'll see a glow around the head of, whatever, whether it's in the Sikh tradition, the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition, they all show it, this brightness around the head. So this is to do with the brightness in the mind. It's beyond mindfulness. It's mindful of whatness. So what is it that's flowing through? And that's where it's not to give up our mind. Our mind is our superpower. It's what we connect it with. So that's what I would highlight. Our predicament then is that we're tending as a human race to be connecting our minds into the energetic qualities or properties which are damaging to our human condition. Say, like example of the most profitable industries, I said before, which is weapons and drugs, even before food. So that's got to say something about the human condition, because if you were coming from another planet and you saw that was the priority, you could only think, this culture it's mad. Something's really gone off the rails here, because they're more intent on destroying each other than helping each other. This is very strange planet, strange place. So our minds are like, if our minds can tune into things like a radio set, our minds as a collective, if we looked at the media as a radio set, they have that saying, if it bleeds, it leads. That's the journalistic saying. So they'll report, there's ongoing many reports on warfare, on trouble. Very rarely do we get an act of spontaneous kindness occurred in Florida today. So yeah, the collective mind keeps going to the destructive, disintegrating stuff. So if we could raise the level of our mind, that really starts to make a change, transformative change.
So let us hold it there, suspended in this recognition of the human predicament and the seeding possibilities of engaging the mind and the human system in a way that's healthier and more productive. And we shall come back to further open the currents that are leading to the insights of the human predicament and the human proposition. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Aviv. Till next.
Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.